Welcome to ODEON Capital Conversations on all things money and markets with Dick BOVE and Matt Van Alstyne. And here is your host, John Aidan Byrne.
The US economy is likely to remain resilient for some time longer, but a debt-fueled recession is inevitable in the next 18 months, according to Dick BOVE. He says the US economy will be facing serious debt servicing problems by the end of 2024, and it's going to crash the US economy. He says interest rates have soared by 50 to 100% in the past 18 months, impacting debt servicing on all types of debt, from government to consumer debt. Dick has all the analysis and details in his new report, and he'll discuss it on this episode of ODEON Capital Conversations. In the event of a massive global recession, the US would be hard hit, but could also see some upside as investors rush to the US markets for safety and opportunities, according to Matt Van Alstyne. We look at the latest events in Africa and at Japan and China. We'll examine Putin's stance on the Black Sea grain deal and what it means for markets, and we'll have much more. I'm with Dick BOVE, Chief Financial Strategist at ODEON Capital Group, and Matt Van Alstyne, ODEON co-founder and managing partner. We'll be right back after this message.
Current and future holdings are subject to risk, and past performance is no guarantee of future results. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. Information presented herein is for discussion and illustrative purposes only and is not a recommendation or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. Securities identified do not represent all of the securities purchased, sold, or recommended to clients. The views and opinions expressed by the ODEON Capital Group speaker are their own as of the date of the recording. Any such views are subject to change at any time based upon market or other conditions, and ODEON Capital Group disclaims any responsibility to update such views. These views should not be relied on as investment advice, and because investment decisions are based on numerous factors, may not be relied on as an indication of trading intent on behalf of any ODEON Capital Group product. Neither ODEON Capital Group nor the speakers can be held responsible for any direct or incidental loss incurred by applying any of the information offered.
Episode 85, Dick and Matt, you're very welcome. There was always this expectation that the economy would take a much bigger hit. It would contract. We would have a recession, just given the aggressive interest rate rises by the Fed in its campaign to tamp down inflation, which peaked last year at over 9%. But in a sense, much of the opposite has happened. We certainly haven't had a recession, and employers added 3.1 million jobs in the past year and 187,000 jobs in August. I hate to overuse the phrase, but I have to use it again. It's mind-boggling, Dick and Matt.
Yeah, no, it is mind-boggling. But, in the past few of these podcasts, I've been taking this position that I don't know where it's going to go or what is going to happen. And I decided that this weekend I was going to take as much time as it took to look through all of the data and come up with a basic conclusion. I've done that in this report that we just released, which anyone can get from their ODEON Capital Group salesman. But what basically I'm trying to do is not talk about inflation, not talk about the Fed, but talk about money flows through the economy. So the report has 4 segments, and I'll go at them one at a time, but I'll stop after each segment rather than just talk all the time. But the first segment basically argues that when the pandemic hit, the United States was headed for a recession. It did get a short, sharp recession. And the Congress responded with, this tremendous stimulus package in which there was a subtle change. This time, they were not going to give money to bail out the banks. They were not going to give money to corporations. They were going to put money in everyone's bank account. And as a result of that, Congress created this deficit, which in one quarter, and this is a seasonally adjusted number, actually was $5.5 trillion. Since there was not a number of ready buyers for treasuries or to buy that debt, the Federal Reserve had to step in and buy it. And they bought close to $4 trillion worth of debt in the next couple of years. that's extraordinarily unusual. The Federal Reserve has never done that before. In other words, been the lender of last resort to the U.S. government. However, the net result of that was $7 trillion was created in the U.S. economy. Now, I know numbers are so big and they get thrown around all the time that it's very hard to know whether 7 trillion is a lot of money or not. It is a lot of money. Okay, it's a phenomenally large amount of money. Now, as a result of their creating that money, all of a sudden personal income started to rise very rapidly. There was a delay, but then personal consumption expenditures started to rise. In other words, government has a big deficit, Fed prints a lot of money, the money gets to households, personal income goes up, personal consumption expenditures go up, the economy goes up. And that money is not fully utilized even to this point, which is why the economy continues to roll, a little bit stronger than expected, much stronger than we expected in the past 12 to 18 months. We think that that's what is causing the current situation to be what it is.
Well, I would just say two things. One, I'm not sure if you were injecting commentary as to the Fed buying the Treasury debt that was, basically issued to save the economy when the government forced shutdowns that required a lot of layoffs and a lot of people to, their businesses suffered. So I'm not sure if the commentary is that they shouldn't have bought it, but it seems like that's kind of a generally accepted rule, behavior for a Fed, going back to the days of at least Walter Bagehot, the famous central banker in Britain who talked about how the Federal Reserve's job is to step in when no one else will. And it seemed like that was the right opportunity. I'm not sure if you're offering commentary or just noting that that's what happened.
No, I'm just noting that's what happened. In other words, basically the Fed, Bagehot is, and he's obviously the founder of The Economist magazine also, which I strongly recommend people read. But anyway, the Fed is the buyer of last resort. If nobody else wants to buy the debt, the Fed does have to step in and do it, whether, it's, theoretically the right thing to do or not, they must do it. And they did it. And I'm not saying that they did anything good or bad, or that anybody else did anything good or bad in terms of creating deficit. All I'm saying is this is what happened. This is what happened.
Fair enough. And obviously that is what happened. And it seemed at the time like I think generally it was widely accepted. And I'm not sure that a lot of people are arguing against that action, except for the people that were arguing against the shutdown itself. And then the Fed's action was a derivative of that. But it seemed like that was consensus that was a good action on behalf of the Fed.
Yeah, I think so.
I'll just add to that kind of a recap as well, but also an observation. So we had the pandemic era spending. And you have a conclusion in your report, Dick, that the surge in money supply in the early 2020s was so overwhelming, trillions, that its impact had yet to be implemented. So this was a really unprecedented situation. And the other comment would be that consumer bank balances swelled to record highs, trillions, and that's now been paid down. Or being spent out, I should say.
Yeah, no, you're right, John. That's exactly what we're saying. We're saying that this money was created to solve a problem, that the money was given this time around to households instead of to banks or other, corporate entities. The money was sitting in the bank balance sheets, if you want to call it that, of each household. And for a few quarters, they didn't spend it because they were still dealing with the pandemic. Then the vaccines came along and they started spending it, and they spent, about $4 trillion of it. And that means that there's still money left over, which, is likely to drive the economy in the third and fourth quarters. But it's going to run out. The second part of this report says what the government then did, it started to reduce the deficit. The deficit now is running about 1.3 trillion. Which is not good at all either, but it's substantially less than 5.5 trillion. At any rate, the second thing that changed, and this is a huge change, is that the Fed didn't have to buy any of it. The Fed didn't buy any of the new debt that was being created because households and businesses, Americans, they stepped up and bought all of the new debt that was being created. So the net effect is the Fed was able to start selling they didn't actually sell it. They let run off treasuries that they owned. They reduced the size of the Fed balance sheet, and the money supply has been dropping now for the last 6 months. So we went from this big amount of money coming into the economy to a situation now where the money is being drained from the economy. Now, my belief is that when we get to 2024 and the middle of 2024, certainly we're no longer going to be dealing with big increases in personal income driven by big increases in the money supply, because the money supply is shrinking. Money supply is going down. The Fed balance sheet is shrinking. So now we're going to run into a major problem with the fact that we are not going to have these money flows, and it is going to impact hiring. It's going to impact, personal income. It's going to impact personal consumption, expenditures, how much money people spend, and it's going to lead us into a recession. And then the third part, if you want, we can comment on that. But the third part, goes to the real difficulty that we're dealing with, in the next year.
The result you see is a recession driven by mounting defaults. Consumers are way in over their head, and corporations, I presume, and other entities are just going to be strapped for capital and cash.
Well, the third part of the report deals with the debt situation, and what it discusses is first that basically the consumer paid down their debt, when all this big surge of money occurred, but in the last 12, 18 months, the consumer has started borrowing again. And if you take a look at credit card borrowing is up 17.7% year over year, and the consumer is not the only one that's been borrowing. Corporations have been increasing their borrowing. And supposedly there's $52 trillion worth of debt outstanding in corporations, agencies, municipalities, et cetera. But they're sticking with corporations. There's $16 trillion now in debt outstanding in corporations. And that's bigger than the $12 trillion in mortgage debt that's outstanding. So not only are consumers increasing their borrowing dramatically, but corporations are increasing their borrowing dramatically. Then, of course, there's the United States government. The United States government may not be borrowing at the rate that they were 3 years ago, but they're still borrowing huge amounts of money. So that's the first problem, that now we've moved away from using the existing cash given by the government to borrowing, which is coming from the private sector of the economy. All right. The second problem is that interest rates have taken off on the upside. Everybody's aware of the fact that the mortgage rate is, gone from roughly 3% to, last week, I guess it hit 7.5%. They may not be just as well aware of the fact that auto loan, interest rates have gone from 4% to 8%. And if you go out to, 72 months on an auto loan, it's 8.5%. They're further not aware of the fact that credit card debt has now gone from 14% as the average rate to over 20%. So, we're not only dealing with the fact that we have this huge increase in debt that has occurred, but in the last 18 months, as a result of, we'll say, Federal Reserve action or whatever you want to call it, interest rates have soared. They have gone up roughly 50% to 100%, depending upon the type of debt that you're dealing with. So how do you calculate that? Well, the U.S. government does put out a number indicating how much money they're paying in interest on their debt. Now, again, remember, their debt went up, and the cost of money to the United States government went up with the increase in interest rates. So in the fourth quarter of 2022, the United States government was paying $600 billion a year in interest. In the quarter that just ended, the second quarter of 2023, they were paying $938 billion in interest. The interest costs to the U.S. government went up more than 50%. And the same thing is happening to the personal borrowers, to the business borrowers, to borrowers around the world. Interest rates driven by higher, if you will, borrowing are driving the amount of money, the debt service payment that you have to make, which is principal and interest on your debt. The debt service payment that you have to pay may be going up as much as 40 to 50%. Now, in my view, that kills consumption. And if it kills consumption, it kills the economy. And that's why I believe, certainly as I say, we're still going through the spending of the money that was created, with that 7 trillion. But when we come to the end of it, which I guess will be the beginning to the middle of 2024, we're going to be dealing with this debt service payment problem, and that's going to crash the economy. And I do not think it's going to be a soft landing.
Are you suggesting that if the Fed were to basically, I don't like using the word monetize, but that's what in my mind they're doing, but basically buying the treasuries and putting it on balance sheet and then collecting the interest payments from the treasury. So I realize the fiscal side has a deficit problem and a funding problem, but as long as they have a willing buyer in the Fed, is it going to be a material drag on the economy, or is it just one of those things that kind of exists out in the ether for people to hear about and think, wow, that sounds really bad, but it doesn't really affect everyone's day-to-day lives?
Yeah, no, in the portion of debt that you just described, which is the treasury debt, assuming that the treasury would have continued to increase the borrowing that it's doing, and assuming that the Federal Reserve would buy that debt, then the interest gets paid by the Treasury to the Federal Reserve. And at the end of the quarter, the Federal Reserve pays that interest back to the Treasury. So in other words, the way it works is, the U.S. Treasury basically owns the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is owned by the United States government. It is an agency of the United States government, even though everybody mentions how it's supposed to be independent, it's independent, and all that other stuff. It is owned by the United States government. And it used to be that at the end of every year, the Federal Reserve would take a look at its profits, and it would give 95% of those profits to the Treasury. Because the government is so strapped for cash all the time, that was changed about 3-4 years ago. I forget the exact date. So now at the end of every 3 months, the Federal Reserve takes a look at its income statement. And at the end of looking at the income statement, it sends a check to the Treasury for 95%, or could be, last quarter, 100% of all of the money that the Fed has earned. And therefore, you get this loop. If the Treasury issues debt and the Federal Reserve buys that debt, and the Treasury pays interest on that debt, and the Federal Reserve gets that interest payment, then the Federal Reserve gives it back to the Treasury. So the Fed is not paying anything for, in reality, it will report that it's paying that much in interest, but in reality, about 40% of the interest that it pays will come right back to the United States government. So what I'm really looking at is consumers and businesses. They're the ones where they don't have the circular situation going on. They're simply going to have to pay more. And if they're going to have to pay more, they're going to have to buy less in the open market. If they start defaulting on their debt, then they're going to get frightened and they're going to stop consuming. And as they stop consuming, the economy starts to slow down and I think slip into recession.
What astounds me, just looking at your charts and graphs, which, by the way, are amazing, is that this deficit that we're basically incurring right now is during a supposedly a time when the economy is supposedly growing. Like, if we hit the brick wall like you're predicting, I don't think you're wrong. I do think this is unsustainable, and that which can't continue forever won't. But the idea that this is the deficits while the economy is good, and this is the interest rate while the economy is good, and this is what the consumer is doing while the economy is good, is terrifying, because this is all going to get worse if the economy takes a left turn.
You mentioned last week is terrifying. You described what's going to happen in November, which I found to be pretty upsetting. You may want to repeat it now because people may not have remembered what you said, but what you said was phenomenal.
Well, I say lots of great things. Which one are you talking about?
Yeah, you said
tax cuts, maybe.
He said in November the government was going to shut down, and that the system whereby there would be, I'm going to call it earmarks. There's a different word for it now, but the system of earmarks that was supposed to keep it going won't be functioning, and the House of Representatives won't be open to discussion, and therefore we're literally going to face a government shutdown.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, that's not necessarily my personal analysis. It's just what you're reading, and it sounds like an intractable problem. The idea that the budgets in America traditionally have begun in the House of Representatives. When I talk about budgets, I'm talking about the federal budget.
Yeah.
It begins with in the House of Representatives in committees that are sectioned out based on what they oversee. So, the EPA gets through a science committee, and the defense budget goes through a defense committee, and so on and so forth. And then it gets consolidated into a big group, an omnibus budget, that then passes the House, and then it goes to the Senate, and then the Senate passes it, and then the president signs it. And that's what we were all taught in elementary school. And for the last 15 or 20 years or so, we've been running, every year from crisis to crisis, where the budget, the government either shuts down or comes close, and then eventually the House passes what's called a continuing resolution, where it kind of freezes funding in place until they can pass a giant budget, which they generally do just before a holiday, late at night when everyone's not paying attention. And Speaker McCarthy made a deal to retain his speakership that they will go back to what they call regular order, which means the committees have to pass all their budgets. And we're sitting here on September 5th, and I read this morning there's 16 congressional days left until the budget expires, and not one committee yet has passed a budget for their respective department. And Democrats are starting to get antsy, saying, why don't we do a continuing resolution? McCarthy seems to be open to it. The Senate says they're open to it. The president said he'll sign whatever they pass. But the people holding McCarthy hostage, the far right wing of the Republican Party, is saying we are not going to allow that happen. We're doing regular order. And if it takes a while, it takes a while. If the government shuts down, the government shuts down. So yeah, that's coming. And I would also point out, that student loan repayments are supposedly have restarted. Now, President Trump suspended interest and payments on student loans at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and he kept that up until he was no longer president. And then President Biden has kept that up, basically continuing, the crisis laws, because he claims that he needs, in order to have the emergency powers to suspend interest rate payments, you have to be in a crisis. So he's been extending that, and that's now all expired. And so student loans are now accruing interest yet again, and payments are supposed to start up again in October, which I can't imagine that's going to be good for people who are already suffering under the debt you're talking about, like credit cards and car loans. I would point out one thing that I point out all the time when we talk about this. When we talk about car loans at 8% and we talk about mortgages at 7%, we're talking about people who've just got one. And in the last 12 months, something like 90 basis points of the housing stock in America has changed hands. So that means 99% of the housing stock has better interest rates than the current ones. And I don't know what the number is on cars. I think it's like the average car is replaced every 6 or 7 years. And so you're talking about 10 to 15% of the car inventory out there at higher interest rates. So it's slowly rolling out to the economy. It's not like everyone one day woke up and had this giant interest rate payment. Most of the consumers are living under the old interest rate regimes. And I would also point out that's also the same with companies and municipalities. When we talk about these high interest rates, a lot of companies and a lot of municipalities recognize that low interest rates weren't going to last forever and got as much debt locked in as they could. And, like myself, I have a 7-year mortgage and it expires in 2027. And I hope that interest rates are better then. If not, I'll figure it out. But, a lot of us are operating under the old interest rate. So it's not the brick wall that it kind of sounds like. But that said, I think you're talking about the cash running out of, the excess savings from the stimulus packages. Like those are brick walls that are not going to be widely distributed.
There's an expiry date, I guess, there too, Dick. You just don't know how long more consumers will come on stream. Just on the credit card debt, Dick, before you respond to Matt, we have US credit card debt now more than $1 trillion. We've hit that record. And as you said, the average credit card interest rate is over 21%, up from 18% a year ago. Card balances are rising, but however, there's an interesting number out there that delinquencies have returned to pre-pandemic levels. That may change, of course.
Yeah, well, I think that if you take a look at the individual companies, Capital One and Discover, who are the two of the biggest credit card companies in the United States, and again, we have no relationship with either company, so I'm just giving you an opinion. You can see that they're and Ally Financial being another one, you can see the increase in delinquencies occurring quarter after quarter. In other words, the numbers are not easing up, they're jumping up at each one of those companies, and they are creating an earnings problem for those companies. But, in terms of what Matt said, he's exactly right. You're not going to see, a large portion of the population, getting hit by this interest rate increase, which is going to change their cash flows. But they are very likely to follow that of the renter, who is going to see his rent continuing to rise, or the people who are pulling back, who are getting hit with the higher interest costs. So I think consumption, this is, I keep saying that this is a grasshopper economy, not an ant economy. Everybody knows the story, Aesop fables, of the grasshopper who sings and plays all day throughout the summer, and the winter comes and he's freezing, and the ants who have been working all summer, storing up for the winter, have to bail him out. The point is that I see us as being a grasshopper economy. In other words, we're all oriented to consumption. We're not oriented to production. And I think that means that it will hit us hard. If at some point you want to talk about the labor numbers that came out last Friday, they're a perfect example of what I'm talking about, being a grasshopper economy instead of an ant economy.
Yeah, we should look at the labor numbers. But another thing we should mention is that $3 trillion in tax cuts approved back in 2017. They're the Trump era tax cuts, I assume, are set to expire. So that adds a new wrinkle as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, Dick. But also, when I listen to your analysis, which is really, it's scary. We're going to enter an election. Well, we're in an election cycle, obviously, and next year a lot of political hardball will be played. And I'm wondering the politics of this. The slowdown starts and the squeeze comes on. We could see a lot of things happening. Biden might say, hey, I'm going to suspend interest payments on student loans. I'm going to do a one-off stimulus check. Interest rates might start to fall back if there's a catastrophe in our economy. There's a lot of the imponderables out there.
Yeah, well, what you say is you've raised 2 points which are very important. Number one, are the people in the right wing of the Republican Party really committed to reducing the deficit? If so, the tax cut is going to expire. If they're not, then the tax cut continue. All right, that's one point. The other point is that the election year. I mean, basically, every president tries to get economic stimulus passed in an election year in order to assure that the economy is soaring at the time of the election and the president gets reelected. I don't think they can do it this time. I think that the Republicans controlling, as Matt said, controlling the purse strings, in the House of Representatives, are not going to allow any bills to go through which are going to give tremendous stimulus to the economy. And therefore, I think that it's going to be another issue that is going to cause what I think is going to be pretty stiff recession by the end of 2024.
So we're seeing this surge in red ink, and we know the numbers. The current national debt is nearing $33 trillion. That apparently comes out to nearly $100,000 per person in America. I'm sick to my stomach here.
That's a lot of money.
You're not even doing the right calculation, because most of those don't include what everyone projects will be an increase of your obligations to Social Security and Medicare, and potentially healthcare.
Well, you've mentioned that unfunded liabilities, so it's worse. This situation is far worse than the headline numbers.
Yeah, it's just not the government. In other words, an entity called SIFMA, SIFMA, has indicated that there's $160 trillion in corporate and municipal debt outstanding in the world, and that 40% of it, roughly $53 trillion, is owed by companies and entities in the United States. And it's growing. it continues to grow. Now, a large portion of that debt has to be refinanced, on a weekly basis, right? In other words, you've got all this debt that's coming up that has to be rolled over on a weekly basis. It's going to be refinanced at a higher rate. And in order to let the economy grow, companies are going to want to increase the size of this debt. For 50 years, I've been arguing that, you can't keep doing this, and we could keep doing this, and we did keep doing this, but I don't see how we can keep doing this at this point. I mean, I do think that there's got to be some rationalization of the debt outstanding, whether it's the federal government debt, whether it's the debt of all the other sovereign nations around the world, whether it's the debt of the corporations, whether it's the debt of consumers. It just can't keep growing, and there being no negative impacts as a result of it.
My favorite part about being negative about our current situation in the United States is going and looking around the world and seeing how we compare to other countries. And, when you look around the world, America is in really bad shape, but I'm not sure there's another country out there that we would rather be. Most of Western Europe has declining demographics. Their share of the global GDP has been declining, basically going on a decade, and it's going to accelerate as their demographic pyramid gets worse. Inverted pyramid, as in there's lots of retirees and very few workers because they're not having babies, and more people are retiring than are being born to replace them in the workforce, and the economy is declining there. And then you look over at Australia and Canada, where they have these giant housing bubbles that make America's housing crisis look tame. You look at China's domestic consumption and their declining exports and their declining demographics. And, the most economists 10 or 15 years ago predicted that China would overtake America and be the strongest economy in the world. And now most projections don't have them ever catching up to the United States. I can go on and on about other countries being worse. And I don't know if being, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king type thing is applicable, but it just kind of seems that way because what country has it better than America? And so I wonder if it's not an if, it's when there's a massive recession. And I thought it was going to happen in 2020, but when there's a massive recession, a global recession, America is probably the place you're going to want to invest. And paradoxically, it could help us because generally when the rest of the world catches a cold, or I guess it's when America catches a cold, the rest of the world catches the flu, foreign investors put their money in treasuries because it's the only safe haven left. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts on the international component of this and how that fits in.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think what is shocking to me is that China, having this huge export surplus, or trade surplus for decades, is actually the second largest debtor in the world. In other words, the United States, I mentioned corporations have 40% of that $160 trillion in debt. China has 16% of it. And there's no other country that comes close to those two. So, I don't, and if you take a look at the Belt and Road Initiative that China has put into place, and nobody seems to know what the amount of money that's outstanding. Boston University says it's $1 trillion. Harvard says it could be close to $6 trillion. So I don't know how much it is. The one thing that we do know is that none of these countries can pay it back. And China is now dealing with the fact that these countries can't pay it back. Russia, is running into significant problems, in terms of funding, its war. You go all through Europe. Italy is supposedly the weakest of the big countries in Europe, but there's a lot of small countries in Europe which aren't doing too well. Latin America is loaded with debt. I mean, everything runs on debt, and it has run on debt for, decades. Can that continue? I'm not sure. I don't believe it can, but I've never believed that it could, and it continued to grow forward. But I think we're going to test this whole system, in the next 12 months.
I've asked a lot over the year so that we've been doing this, but do you have any thoughts on Japan and vis-a-vis America? And, they've been doing this game of monetizing their debt for 20 some odd years now. Do you think that their path is what we can see in the future for America, which is basically flat GDP, kind of flat inflation while monetizing the debt and keeping this train going?
I think Japan, I remember, when Japan was at the height of its strength, economically, this guy who was running to be the premier of Japan wrote this book saying Japan can say no. Basically, he was arguing, look, we're so strong now, we're so capable now, that if we don't want to listen to what the United States says, we'll just say no, and we should say no. And all of a sudden, Japan collapsed. All right. But this significant difference between why Japan is in trouble and why the United States is never going to become a Japan. Number one, it's a highly racist society. Number two, it has been very strongly anti-immigration. Number three, as you mentioned repeatedly, the population of the country is declining. Number four, it lives on exports. Japan does not have a resource, in terms of a large amount of raw materials. It does have a good manufacturing sector, but it doesn't have the capability to take care of its future growth by relying on its internal resources. The United States has plenty of natural resources. The United States does have a manufacturing base, which is hurting now, obviously, but they've got it. The United States is being subjected to tremendous amounts of immigration. The United States is not a racist society. The United States is different. The United States is better, stronger, and it will not be a Japan, in my view, ever.
Got to pick you up real quickly, Dick, on Japan. They have been easing up on their immigration policies. You are correct. I mean, the idea of taking in immigrants to Japan over the years was anathema to the public consciousness, as it were, but now they're coming from the Philippines and maybe China even. And then there's a wrinkle on this, is that because of the devaluation in the Japanese currency, a lot of young Japanese are working abroad now and get just great value on their earnings. But that literally is a wrinkle. I'm thinking of what Matt said last week, which sort of, I think, plays into all of this decoupling in the global economy. We mentioned how America is in a stronger position, and it's all relative, we know, because the globe is a mess anyway. But we have this return of manufacturing on some scale in America, and the idea that doing things more locally is good for business. And we have all the natural resources, and I guess the US dollar remains the reserve currency, at least for now anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in the United States. I'm a believer in our system is better, our democracy is better, our capitalism is better. But we do have this debt problem. But I want to go to that labor report based upon what you just said, John. And that is, I keep expecting that manufacturing is going to be the driving force that keeps America in good shape over the next couple of decades. But, the newest labor report shows that where the workers are being added is in the consumption sectors. In other words, over the last 12 months, there have been 71,000 new employees added in the healthcare area. There have been 40,000 new employees in leisure and hospitality. There have been, 26,000 new employees in, different social assistance, I'll call it transfer payment areas. There were only 16,000 added in manufacturing. And if construction was up 8,000. And, manufacturing, the way I'm looking at the numbers includes, oil and gas production, and energy production. It's just not happening. The country is just not doing it. And it has to do it because the only way to get out of the problems that we're mentioning here is to increase manufacturing capability. I find it very frustrating that numbers like this can exist. For every one person added in manufacturing, there were 3 persons added, 2.5 people added in leisure and hospitality. It's not going to get us where we need to be.
So the numbers, your numbers, and from the official numbers show that the manufacturing is not. It is coming back somewhat. I mean, according to official reports, they're breaking ground on some major plants across the country with the CHIPS Act fueling some spending and the Inflation Reduction Act. But it's you're saying it's de minimis. It's actually not significant.
Well, as I said, 16,000 people were added in manufacturing. 71,000 were added in health. What does that tell you? It tells you that it may be coming back, and it certainly is coming back according to those numbers, but it's not coming back as fast as it needs to.
Picking up on China, the Wall Street Journal reported fears about a brain drain from China of highly educated, maybe scientists and wealthy Chinese. They've left, obviously, over the years, some of them, and some of them set up home in the US. It's an interesting phenomenon. You notice a lot of really highly qualified Chinese buy homes here, open businesses and so on, and contribute massively to America. The Wall Street Journal did a study on this and said about 9,000 high net worth people left China a year for much of the 2010 period, that decade starting in 2010. Then since about 2018, more Chinese millionaires have been emigrating, with another 13,500 expected to leave this year. I mean, that's just kind of shows a lot of things that are going on there on top of all of its other problems.
Well, the problem that China is probably going to run into is whether it should put capital controls on, because of the fact that, they're accustomed to, everybody wanting to bring capital into China. But this guy, Xi Jinping, he's the emperor of China. And unfortunately, he has put in place a whole series of rules which make it unpalatable for firms to bring capital into China. It's made it unpalatable for a lot of people who live in China, who developed wealth or control of countries, to stay there, because he's taken and attacked the biggest companies in the country because he doesn't want them to be a threat to the Communist Party. So China, he's going to have to change his policies dramatically, or there will be a capital drain coming out of China, and it will hurt China. And then they will put on capital controls, and that's going to be negative for everybody.
Well, I would point out, I think they already have very strict capital controls, and that's actually one of the reasons they have the dilemma that they're in, which is a lot of people have gotten wealthy, and consumption is not a big part of their economy, and you can't invest outside of China. And so it's driven this loop of overinvestment within China, which is now where we are with their real estate crisis. And so I think it would be a benefit to their economy if they opened up capital exports, because then they could start buying and investing and owning assets outside of China, where the investments might be more attractive, and they could kind of get more integrated into the global economy. And I think the reason he's not allowing that is because it's political. He doesn't want investors at home having wandering eyes abroad.
No, I didn't realize that capital controls were that strong. So thank you for the correction. But the problem is evident, as to what they should be doing. But the area that interests me most in the world right now is Africa, by far, because that's where the dynamic growth is occurring in populations. That's where the ferment has become the greatest. And what worries me about Africa is that, this Wagner group, which this guy Prigozhin set up, in which apparently Putin has now taken over, that's operating in a large number of countries in Africa. They're, countries that, you don't hear of because they're not the big ones, like the Central African Republic, which is actually territorially as big as France, Libya, which is always in ferment, Mali, Sudan. They're in Mozambique, Eritrea, and there are two Congo republics, one at Brazzaville and one at one other city that I don't remember, and they're in one of the two of those. On the other side, you've got China, which is in there by lending money to all these countries. I mean, Obviously, there's a whole bunch of BRICS, that are associated with China. But if you take a look at where they've loaned money to Angola, Cameroon, Republic of the Congo, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Zambia. They're into Kenya and Nigeria in major ways. So on one side, you got the Chinese coming in with the soft approach, lending money, which, by the way, they're probably never going to get back. Then you got the hard approach, in which Putin is putting this Wagner group in these countries, supporting these dictators and getting control of the natural resources in those nations. So I would really like to see the United States making a bigger thrust. France is absolutely blowing it in Africa. They gave up, the colonial control of a bunch of these countries in the area, but they kept their armies there, so that even though they walked away, in terms of saying we don't control the government, since their army was there and their army was supporting the dictators, France is now being actively pushed out of Africa. They're being pushed out of Benin, Burkina Faso, Niger, Cameroon, Central African Republic, and Mali. There are actually riots in the Central African Republic where they're throwing out the French army, and there are people wrapping themselves in the Russian flag or in pictures of Putin. So that, I just think that we got to start focusing more on Africa. We've got to somehow, create an influence there as big or as necessary as what the Russians and the Chinese are trying to do, because I think we're still stronger in Africa than they are. We don't talk about Africa as a nation, as a legislature, as a president. I think we should start doing something there.
I think in one of those countries, Dick, the French military presence was really minimal. It was like down to a couple of hundred soldiers trained in the local troops. But yeah, it's interesting to think of that hoisting photos or portraits of Putin. They're certainly not hoisting portraits of Joe Biden.
No, but I mean, the point, France overdid it. France overdid it. They just, they will have a couple of hundred people in any one of these countries now, because country by country, they're throwing them out.
Let's not pretend that America is not there as well. But I don't know if you mentioned this or not. I think you glossed over it, but you mentioned Burkina Faso. They're on the list of, in the last couple of years, there have been 5 or 6, including last week, coups of these countries where the military has come in and taken over. And I read the same press reports you read, which it seems like they're at least implying that Russia is behind the coup to some degree or other. And if it's not Russia, then it's Al Qaeda or the Islamic State. But I agree that we have no visibility to what's happening over there, or very little visibility. But you just read the demographics, and I know I keep harping on demographics, but while the West demographics are in one direction only, except for the United States, and ours is only sustained broadly through immigration, the only countries that are growing in the world are in Africa and to some degree in Southeast Asia. But China's not growing. Europe's not growing. North America is not growing. South America is barely growing, but it's rapidly beginning to stop growing. And so the entire population growth of the United States or of the world is going to come from Africa. And it's hard to imagine that happens without economics shifting, the economic balance shifting heavily into that direction as they gain population and try to lift themselves up out of poverty.
Yeah, of course they need political stability, but there are quite a substantial number of stable African democracies. Any thoughts, either of you, on this hardball Putin was playing on the grain deal, allowing grain to go through the Black Sea and holding it up and wanting the West to acquiesce to his demands? One of my thoughts was that if that grain doesn't get through, it's obviously a shocking tragedy on many levels, but will that fuel more inflationary pressures in Europe as opposed to, let's say, the US?
Well, it certainly will, because, we are, my belief is we are still net grain exporters. Russia is a net grain exporters. exporter. So I think that the two countries that will benefit most from it, I think Brazil is a net grain exporter also. I think the two countries that benefit most from this thing that Russia has done is Russia itself and the United States, because Russia is not saying, we're not going to let you have grain because we're going to stop the Ukrainian ships from getting to your ports. They're saying, we'll provide whatever grain you need. You don't need the Ukraine. And of course, the United States farmers will certainly be happy to provide what the Ukraine is not providing. So I think, grain prices may go up. I mean, the wheat price went up today because of the breakdown in the talk between Putin and Erdogan. But I don't think there's going to be a grain shortage in the world. And I think that, basically, the United States will benefit along with Russia if they shut the Ukrainian grain exports down.
Dick, we're almost out of time. Going back to our original conversation on the economy, your view that we'll be in a recession sometime in 2024. You went through all the numbers and the debt and the federal deficit and consumers being strapped. From now into the end of the year, where are we at? Well,
I mentioned the first three parts of this report I wrote. There is a fourth part, which is what do we do about it? And my belief is that you should be buying government debt. You should be buying treasuries. You should be buying, a lot of corporate debt. And I think that, my particular proclivity is to buy bank debt. The banks are going to be issuing what could be as much as $40 billion in new debt over the next couple of months because of these new rules that are being put into effect by the banking regulators, the Federal Reserve. So I think people have to protect themselves. And I think that's the way they do it. I think they go to where they can get a decent yield, where there is no real risk of loss of capital. And I think that if they do that, somehow we will work through the problems that we have. We always do, but we'll come through it in good shape. I think if they look at government debt, if they look at, corporate debt, if they look at bank debt, and if they look at preferred stocks in those companies, that's how they protect themselves.
And the title of your report is The Economy Likely to Remain Strong a Bit Longer. However,